Montana Territory, October 1879. The letter in his pocket was folded crisp and clean. But Xavier Kade had read it enough times to know each word by heart. He rode hard beneath a pale sky, the horizon dusted in snow, 30 miles behind him and the thought of her face ahead. Her name was Blythe Remington. He remembered her from years ago before the war, before the land stole so much from so many. She had been 16, all sharp wit and soft freckles, and he had been 18 with calloused hands and not much else. Her family moved away before he could ever tell her how he felt. Now, 5 years later, her handwriting had found him. Xavier reached the edge of the Bitterroot Range just as the sun broke over the ridgeline. His horse, a tired sorrel named Dust, huffed heavy in the cold air. Xavier slowed him to a walk as the cabin came into view, small, weathered, and alone at the base of a hill. Smoke curled from the crooked chimney. He reached into his coat and touched the letter once more. "Xavier, if you get this, please come. I would never ask if it weren't bad. I am alone. I do not know what else to do." Blythe, he dismounted and knocked once. The door opened fast. Blythe stood there, her eyes wide, the same deep green that used to undo him. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose braid, her dress plain, her boots worn. She looked thinner than he remembered, tired too, but she was still Blythe. "Xavier," she whispered. Her voice cracked. "Hey, B," he said softly, using the nickname he had once said without thinking, back when they sat by creeks and talked about everything but what they felt. She stepped back, letting him inside. The place was small and cold. 2 chairs, a stove, and a cot in the corner. A little boy sat on the floor, maybe 4 years old, holding a wooden horse with a missing wheel. A girl, older maybe 7, stood behind a half-open curtain that barely hid the second cot. "They yours?" Xavier asked, voice gentler now. Blythe nodded. "Willett and Wren, they're mine." He watched the boy glance up at the sound of his name. Big brown eyes quiet, the girl didn't move. "Where's their father?" he asked. "Gone. He left 2 winters ago, said he was going to Fort Benton for work, never came back." Xavier nodded once. He did not press further. "I did not know who else to write," she said, her voice shaking. "You did write," he answered. Blythe turned away, busying herself with the stove. Her hands were trembling. "We barely made it through last winter. I had to trade the last of the hens last week just to get salt. We're out of wood. Wolves have been near. She stopped, biting the inside of her cheek. Xavier crossed the room. He took the kettle from her hand and set it down softly. "You do not have to explain. I am here now." She looked up at him, and for a moment the weight on her shoulders seemed too much. He stepped back, giving her space. "I will chop wood." "Dust needs rest anyway." She nodded, brushing a tear away before it could fall. By noon, the woodshed was stacked high. Willett followed Xavier around the yard, clutching his little horse. Wren watched from the window. She had not said a word, not even when Blythe coaxed her. "She does not speak much," Blythe said later as they shared a meal of beans and stale bread by the fire. "Not since he left." Xavier kept his hat in his lap, boots dusty, hands rough from the axe. "She will when she is ready. No one rushes a heart." Blythe glanced at him then. That old warmth stirred in her chest, something she had not felt in years. Not since before the silence, before the fear, before the loneliness set its roots deep. That night he stayed in the barn. The next morning he was up before dawn, already mending the fence before she lit the stove. 3 days passed. The wind turned colder. He fixed the roof, patched her door, hunted a deer in the hills and smoked the meat. Blythe cooked again, real food, and Willett smiled more. Wren watched Xavier with quiet eyes, and just once she handed him a scrap of cloth for the fire. It snowed on the 4th day. Xavier stood by the window watching the flakes fall slow and thick. Blythe stood beside him, arms crossed, her shoulder brushing his. "You stayed," she said. "I did." "Why?" He turned to her. "Because you asked me to." She shook her head. "No. That is not why." He did not answer right away. Instead, he looked at her the same way he did when they were younger, like she was the only thing in the world that made sense. "I remembered your face," he said, quiet. "Every day. I remembered it even when I could not remember much else." Blythe's throat tightened. She looked down, but he reached for her hand, rough fingers, warm and sure. "I never forgot you either," she said, voice barely a whisper. The silence stretched, but it was not empty. It was full. That night, Wren tugged at Xavier's coat as he passed by her cot. She pointed to a corner of the room where a small pile of blankets lay. "For you," she said. Her voice was soft, like wind through pine. Xavier smiled, crouched beside her, and said, "Thank you, little dove." She nodded once, proud. The days passed easier after that. They laughed more. Blythe hummed when she cooked. Willett rode on Xavier's shoulders. Wren sat beside him by the fire and listened to stories of rivers and horses and stars. And Blythe, she looked at Xavier like she had once looked at her future. Like maybe it was not gone after all. One morning, just before Christmas, Xavier found her in the garden bed, clearing snow off the frozen ground. "What are you doing?" he asked, laughing. "Trying to believe spring will come," she said, cheeks red from the cold. He walked over, pulled her up by the hand, and kissed her before she could say another word. It was not rushed. It was not stolen. It had waited years. And she kissed him back like she had been waiting just as long. By late January, the snow lay deep enough to swallow a wagon wheel. The world had gone quiet under its weight, and everything moved slower except the days between them. Xavier had taken to carving lengths of pine for Willett, shaping them into toy animals with his pocket knife. The boy sat cross-legged near the hearth, eyes wide with quiet reverence as the shapes came alive under Xavier's hands. Wren had taken to sketching them in charcoal on flattened feed sacks, her lines careful, her gaze steady. Blythe noticed the way her daughter had begun to hum again. One evening, as the wind clawed at the shutters, Xavier laid a copper kettle on the stove and turned to Blythe, brushing wood shavings from his shirt. "You ever think of selling this place?" She looked up from the mending in her lap. "I've thought of losing it." "That's different." He nodded and didn't ask more. She set her needle down. "Why do you ask?" "Because I think you could start fresh somewhere. Somewhere with more than one neighbor and a road that doesn't vanish in snow. You ever seen Helena?" She shook her head. "Only in newspapers." "It sounds loud." "It is, but it's got schools and doctors and markets that don't close when a wagon wheel breaks." She folded the shirt she'd been sewing and leaned her elbows on her knees. "You thinking of going?" "I was thinking of asking if you'd want to." She didn't answer for a long while. The fire popped and hissed. Wren leaned asleep against her brother's shoulder, the two of them curled under a quilt near the warmth. "We buried my mother under that pine behind the barn," Blythe said finally. "And the root cellar's full of her jars. I used to think I'd die here too. But I don't want that anymore." Xavier didn't speak. He didn't need to. She watched him lean back, his face unreadable but not distant. "I'd go," she said softly, "but only if you came too." He looked at her then, and something shifted in his jaw. "I'm not the same man I was when I left for the war," he said, "and I ain't proud of everything I did to come back." "I'm not asking for pride," she said. "I'm asking for you." The kettle began to whistle. Neither of them moved. Later that night, she found him in the barn, checking the roof for leaks. He had a lantern hanging near the beams, his breath fogging in the cold. "I can't offer much," he said without turning, "but I'll work until my hands give out. And I'll never walk away." She stepped closer, her boots crunching on old straw. "You already gave more than I asked for," she said. "You showed up." He turned then, and she reached for the lantern, setting it aside so there was only the moonlight between them. She took both his hands in hers, rough palms to rough palms. "Let's go find spring together." He bent his head, and she met him there. They left in March, 2 weeks after the thaw began. Willett rode in the wagon beside the milk goat Blythe had bartered for. Wren held a small satchel of her drawings, wrapped in cloth. Blythe wore a wool coat Xavier had stitched an extra lining into, and Xavier rode beside the wagon, his rifle strapped across his back, eyes always scanning the horizon. They traveled slow, following the river south. Blythe taught Wren to read from a psalter she had packed long ago, and Xavier showed Willett how to track deer prints in mud. On the third night, they camped near a stand of cottonwoods. Blythe unpacked a pan of cornbread she'd made that morning and handed Xavier the first piece. He took it, breaking it in half. "You baked this on a wagon wheel," she nodded. "Worked fine." He chuckled, then caught her hand under the stars. "You ever think we'd end up here?" "I didn't think I'd end up at all," she said. "But you changed that." "You did the hard part," he said. "No," she said, curling her fingers through his. "We did." And there, beside the fire, with the children sleeping and the moon high above them, Xavier Kade kissed Blythe Remington like they had all the time in the world, because now they did. The road into Helena curled between hills greening with early spring. Meltwater ran in thin rivulets across the wagon ruts, and wagon wheels groaned against the softened earth. Blythe sat beside the children, one gloved hand resting on Wren's back, her eyes on the sweep of rooftops and chimneys rising ahead. She hadn't expected the place to be so wide, nor the hills behind it to feel so close. Xavier rode just ahead, reins slack in his hand, his gaze skimming over storefronts and stone buildings as if measuring each one for threat or welcome. He'd shaved that morning at the river, a quiet ritual she hadn't interrupted. Now the sharp line of his jaw looked more certain than ever, like it had made its peace with the man he'd become. "You sure this is a place for us?" she asked, her voice low so the children wouldn't stir from their doze. He didn't glance back. "We'll know before nightfall." They passed under a wooden arch where a sign read Main Street. Horses were hitched nose to tail along the boardwalk, and everywhere folks moved with a purpose, carrying bolts of cloth, crates of flour, barrels of nails. A woman in a green bonnet crossed in front of the wagon, her skirt heavy with mud at the hem. Blythe caught the scent of baking bread from somewhere close, and her stomach tightened before she could stop it. At the end of the street, Xavier drew up beside a 2-story building with whitewashed siding and a small iron bell mounted above the door. "Rooms upstairs," he said. "Stables behind." Blythe helped Willett down, then Wren, who held fast to her mother's arm as they stepped onto the walk. The children stared at the bustle with wide eyes, but neither clung nor cried. Xavier unhitched the wagon, speaking low to the boy who came to take the reins. Inside, the woman behind the desk had silver hair pinned in a twist and spectacles resting low on her nose. Her eyes lingered on Blythe's boots, the dust on Xavier's coat, the children. "We'll need 2 rooms," Xavier said. "Side by side." The woman's mouth thinned. "That'll be $3.50 a week. Meals are extra." Blythe reached for her coin purse, but Xavier laid his hand over hers, firm and brief. "We'll take them." Upstairs, the rooms were plain but clean. The windows opened toward the hills, and the beds had quilts that smelled faintly of mint. Blythe unpacked in silence while Wren traced the swirl of a knot in the floorboards with her finger. Across the hall, Xavier's boots thudded twice, then stopped. That evening, after the children had eaten and been coaxed into sleep, Blythe stepped into the hallway to find Xavier leaning against the frame of his doorway, arms crossed. "There's a boarding school," he said. Stone building near the courthouse. I spoke with the headmistress, her brow furrowed. For Wren, and Willett when he's old enough, they take girls sooner. She leaned against the wall beside him, fingers twining in front of her. Would she have to stay there, weekdays, home on weekends? They teach them letters, numbers, stitching, even music. Blythe looked down the hall, her voice quiet. I never learned more than my name and the Bible. You'd like her to have more. I want her to know she can ask questions and expect answers, he nodded. Then we'll see it done. A clock chimed somewhere below. Neither of them moved. You still carry the letter? She asked. He reached into his coat and held it out, the fold soft now from wear. She took it, turning it over in her hands. I thought it would be the last thing I ever wrote, she said. I hoped it wouldn't be. She stepped closer. You never asked why I wrote it. I didn't need to. Well, I'm telling you now, I was afraid. He met her eyes. Of what? That I'd go another year without saying your name out loud. His breath caught. She touched his hand just once, just enough. You think we belong here? She asked. I think we belong where you feel safe enough to speak. She nodded, tears pricking uninvited. Then I'll stay. He reached forward, brushing her cheek with the backs of his fingers. So will I. She stepped into him, resting her brow against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, solid and warm. Through the thin wall, a horse whinnied in the stable yard. Somewhere down the street, a fiddle carried a song through open windows. I want to build again, she whispered. Not just survive. He pressed a kiss into her hair. Then let's build. And in that long, quiet hallway, with nothing grand to witness it but the settling of the floorboards beneath them, they stood together, no longer waiting. The boarding school had high windows and red brick walls that caught the morning light like fire. Blythe stood near the gate, coat drawn close, watching Wren walk up the steps with her satchel clutched to her chest. The girl didn't look back, not once, but Blythe saw her shoulders square, saw the careful pride in her steps. It held her still long after the door closed. Xavier waited by the wagon, hands in his coat pockets, watching the horse's paw at the frozen ground. When Blythe finally turned, he didn't speak, just offered his hand. She took it without hesitation. They walked together past shops with shuttered windows and down a lane edged with picket fences and garden beds still sleeping under last frost. The town had begun to feel less like a place they'd arrived in and more like one they might belong to. She wanted to carry her own books, Blythe said after a while. She wanted to walk in on her own terms. She's braver than I was at her age. Xavier glanced over. She gets that from you. They stopped outside a narrow storefront with a hand-painted sign that read, Miss Ellery's Seam and Stitch. Through the window, a woman adjusted a bolt of calico on a counter. Blythe looked at the faded blue fabric in the corner display and pressed her hand lightly to the glass. I heard she needs help with mending and plain sewing, Blythe said. You thinking of asking? I'm thinking of doing something that isn't just scraping by. Xavier stepped back so she could pass through the door first. A brass bell rang as they entered, and the woman inside looked up. By noon, Blythe had a job. They returned to the boarding house just as Willett woke from his midday nap. He greeted them with a wooden dog tucked under one arm, hair mussed and cheeks flushed from sleep. Xavier lifted him easily, resting the boy against his shoulder. I start tomorrow, Blythe said, brushing a curl from Willett's forehead. 4 days a week. She said I could bring him if he behaves. I'll take him some days, Xavier said. There's a man near the stockyards who needs help with harness repair. I told him I'd come by. She looked up. You didn't mention that. It only came this morning. He saw me fixing the bridle outside the stable and asked if I'd worked leather before. And have you? Enough to keep a saddle together. I'll learn the rest. He set Willett down and the boy toddled toward the window, pressing his face to the glass. "You think we can do this?" Blythe asked, voice low. "I think we already are." That night, the room smelled of beeswax and warm bread. Blythe had baked the loaf with flour bought from her first advance at the shop. While Willett played quietly with his carved animals near the hearth, Xavier sat at the table, sleeves rolled, mending a tear in his shirt with a needle she'd threaded for him. "Never thought I'd be doing this," he said, squinting at the fabric. "What, sewing?" "No, sitting at a table with a roof overhead and a boy underfoot." She folded the last of the clean linens and set them on the chair beside her. "I don't want to lose what we have now." "You won't. You can't know that. I can promise it." She sat beside him, not touching, not rushing. "Do you think it's strange how all of this," she gestured to the small room, the folded linens, the boy humming to himself, "feels like it was always waiting?" "No," he said. "I think it just needed the right time." She watched him thread the needle again, slower now, more sure. "Did you ever think, when you rode out with that letter, that it might lead here?" "I didn't think ahead at all," he said. "I just knew I had to get to you." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The needle paused mid-thread. Their fingers curled together. "I'm glad you did," she said. "I'd do it again," he said. "Every mile." Outside, the wind had quieted, the night holding steady. Willett nodded off on the braided rug, clutching his wooden dog. Blythe stood to lift him, and Xavier followed, pulling back the quilt on the small cot as she laid the boy down. They turned off the lamp and stood by the window a while longer, watching the stars settle over the rooftops. The town was still. Their world was small, but it was full. Xavier reached for her hand again, and this time she didn't let go. By mid-May, the fields behind the boarding house burst with wild mustard and larkspur, and the breeze carried warmth instead of warning. The town had thawed fully, and so had they. Xavier spent his days at the harness shop mending tack and oiling leather until his fingers smelled of linseed and smoke. Blythe worked steady hours at the seamstresses, stitching hems and bodices until her hands ached in the gentlest way. Each evening they returned to the upstairs rooms, where Willett met them at the door with chalk on his palms, and Wren brought her schoolwork to the table with quiet diligence. They had fallen into a rhythm built not on duty, but on choice. One Friday morning, Blythe crossed the street with a wrapped parcel under her arm. She paused outside the livery where Xavier stood brushing down a horse with a coat the color of iron. He looked up, squinting against the sun. "I finished it," she said, offering the bundle. He untied the string and unfolded the cloth to reveal a shirt, deep blue with fine stitching along the cuffs. He ran his thumb along the seams. "You made this." "I'd say I patched it together, but that would be a lie." "Took me 3 nights." He held it up, letting the morning light catch on the thread. "You want me to wear it somewhere. I want you to wear it because it's yours." He folded it slowly, his jaw working in thought. "You know, I've been thinking." "That sounds dangerous," he chuckled. "I've got a wagon of my own now, tied it up behind the shop. It's not much, but I can haul with it. There's a ranch east of town that needs deliveries twice a week. Offered me coin to take it on." "That's good," she said. "I want to buy land, not tomorrow, but soon. Something just outside town, enough to raise 2 goats without them eating the roof." Her eyes caught his, waiting. "I want to build us a home, Bea. One with 4 walls and a stove that doesn't lean. I want to ask you something proper, but I don't have a ring yet. I've been saving." She looked down at the dust between them, then back at him. "I don't need a ring, but I want to give you one," he said, "because you deserve more than what the war left me." "You've given me more than I ever dared to hope for," she said. "And if you ask me, I'll answer now, with or without silver." He stepped forward, wrapped his arms around her, and held her there in the middle of the street while the world passed quiet around them. "Then marry me," he said against her hair. "Yes," she whispered. They were wed 3 weeks later in a plain chapel with whitewashed pews and a bell that tolled just once. Wren chose a dress with yellow ribbons, and Willett stood between them, holding Xavier's hand until the preacher called it done. There was no feast, just a warm supper with neighbors who'd come to know them, and a pie Blythe had risen early to bake. That night, in the room that no longer felt borrowed, Blythe sat beside the window and unpinned her hair. Xavier watched her from the bed, the lamp casting long shadows across the floorboards. "You nervous?" he asked. "Only that I might wake and find it's still winter." He stood, crossed the room, and knelt beside her. "If it is, we'll build the fire again." She turned, meeting him halfway, her kiss slow and certain. Outside, the wind turned soft through the trees, and summer stirred in the grass. Years passed. The house they built stood on a rise east of Helena, with a wide porch and a root cellar that stayed dry even in the heaviest rain. Xavier kept 2 wagons under the lean-to, and Blythe's sewing earned its own room with shelves of folded cloth. Wren finished her schooling and took to teaching younger children in the chapel's back room. Willett grew strong, always at Xavier's side, learning the weight of tools and the names of stars. Each evening, when the day's work was done, Blythe and Xavier sat on the porch, her hand resting on his knee, his thumb tracing circles on her wrist. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills and the air turned gold, Blythe leaned her head against Xavier's shoulder. "You remember the cabin?" she asked. "I remember everything." "I thought I was asking for a rescue. You were asking for a beginning," he said, "and it was."